Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever in the world you may be joining us from today. My name is Francesco Del Carpio, and I am the CFAL York Operations Coordinator. I would like to officially open the second session of the Governance, Science, and Technology of Mass Evacuation speaker series, presented in partnership with YEmerge at York University, the McEachern Institute for Public Policy at Dalhousie University, and the Institute for Intergovernmental Relations at Queen's University. I would like to begin today's session with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territory upon which our campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area is known as Tikaranto and has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and that the territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. The McEachern Institute at Dalhousie University is located on Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq peoples. As this is an online event and our participants may be joining from various locations, I strongly encourage you to learn about the traditional land upon which you are located. With this, I welcome our moderator, our panelists, our American Sign Language interpreters, and our participants from around the world. Welcome to our webinar. I would now like to pass the floor to Dr. Asghari, Professor of Disaster and Emergency Management at York University, Director of CFAL York, and Associate Director of YEmerge, for some welcome remarks and to introduce today's moderator. Thank you very much, Dr. Asghari. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francesco, and thank you all for joining us. Based on my records, we have about 255 people registered for this series. Thank you to all of you. We are really pleased to be part of this speaker series from CFAL York. As you know, CFAL York is a center jointly created by UN UNITAR and York University in collaboration with York Region. We have a number of focus areas, one of which is, of course, disaster and emergency management and humanitarian response. While we all know the best effort from disaster and emergency management perspective is to mitigate the risk, prepare for emergencies, and hopefully no community needs evacuation and mass evacuation in large, but still there are situations where this is needed and we have to go through this. Mass evacuation, as we all know, is a very critical function and operation within the emergency management response, requires significant preparation and resources from every part of society. And of course, it is a very difficult situation for evacuees who have to leave, sometimes short-term, sometimes mid-term, and sometimes even long-term. So it is a very important aspect of emergency management. And I'm sure those who have already been through this process, either as a victim or evacuees or as managers, they realize how or appreciate how complicated this process is. And apart from that, we also have focus areas on equity and justice. And through that lens, we are really happy to dedicate some components of this speaker series to mass evacuation and First Nation, especially during this month that is our Indigenous months we focus on. I also, before I introduce our great moderator for the session, I also want to thank all of you participating in this session, particularly Professor McGee for not only being available to present in this session, but also bringing in the speakers for this panel together and supporting this whole session in all aspects of it. Thank you very much, Professor McGee. And with that, I also would like to introduce our dear colleague, Dr. Eric Kennedy, who will be moderating this session. Dr. Kennedy is an associate professor of disaster and emergency management at York University. Dr. Kennedy serves also as director-in-chief of the Canadian Journal of Emergency Management, proudly, and as well as associate director of York University's Emergency Mitigation Engagement Governance Response Institute, or YEMERGE. Dr. Kennedy focuses on wildfire management and the human and social dimensions of fire. In particular, his lab works on decision making and use of evidence for wildfire preparedness, response, and recovery. Dr. Kennedy conducts extensive work in the context of wildfire management, exploring how communities and governments can better prepare for a changing climate and increasing fire load. He has also led a national COVID-19 monitoring project, tracking the public attitudes, risk perceptions, and knowledge related to the pandemic. In all his work, he focuses on producing research that addresses real-world needs, supports government decision-making, and helps create a safe and more equitable world. With that, I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Kennedy, and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you so much. Dr. Kennedy, floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Dr. Asghari, and thank you all for joining us today for this session. What an incredibly important topic, and I am just so excited for the next hour ahead to learn from these speakers and for the conversation that will follow. Speaking of the conversation, we do want this to be interactive and to be based on your questions, and so I'd encourage you to use the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen to add your questions to the conversation. I'll do my best to bring together as many as we possibly can during the last 15 minutes or so, which we plan to hold for discussion and conversation among our panelists. So please feel free to submit your questions there throughout our conversation today. We have 4 fantastic speakers coming up, each of whom will share a brief presentation. And we begin with an inspiration of mine in the fire field. Dr. Tara McGee is a researcher who focuses on the individual, community, and organizational responses to wildfire, among other environmental hazards. She has truly completed numerous studies on the human dimensions of wildfire, and has written seminal work including on wildfire risk perception, prevention, mitigation, preparedness, evacuation, and recovery. Most of her human dimensions of wildfire research is based in Canada, including with the First Nations Wildfire Evacuation Partnership. Although Dr. McGee's research has focused mostly on wildfires, she has also carried out and supervised research related to other hazards, including floods, earthquakes, and avalanches. And Tara, it's been such a pleasure to learn so much from your work and from your incredible contributions to the field over the past decades. So thank you for being here, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thanks so much. I'll share my screen, shall I? Thank you so much for the introduction, kind introduction, and for everyone in the audience. I'd like to start by acknowledging where I am. So I live in, and the University of Alberta is located in Amiskwacy, Waskagan, Beaver Hills House, Edmonton. I respectfully acknowledge that we're situated on Treaty 6 territory and Métis Nation of Alberta Zone 4, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis peoples. From a personal perspective, I'm continuing on my learning journey as a treaty person, and part of which has been the research that I'll be speaking to you about today. As we all know, likely, thousands of Canadians are evacuated from their homes every year due to wildfires. Is the screen sharing working?
Looks good from my end.
Okay, great. Between 1980 and 2007, there were an average of just over 3,500 evacuees per year. 1/3 of these evacuations involved Indigenous peoples, mainly First Nations. The research that I'll be presenting today started in 2011 just over 10 years ago now, a year when thousands of residents in 35 First Nations and Métis communities in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario were evacuated. So just in terms of background, in Canada, when a wildfire or other hazard event occurs, the initial response, including a decision about whether or not to declare a state of emergency and potentially evacuate, rests with the chief, often in consultation with the provincial or territorial wildfire management agency and the federal government. If an evacuation is called, many agencies are involved in carrying it out, including the First Nation Band Council and other community members, federal and provincial government departments, the police, non-government organizations, and communities that host evacuees. So just a quick introduction to the First Nations Wildfire Evacuation Partnership. So the aims of the first phase of the partnership, which started in 2013, were to explore First Nations wildfire evacuation experiences, to identify factors that affected evacuation experiences in both positive and negative ways, and thirdly, to recommend ways to reduce negative impacts of wildfire evacuations. The research team, in addition to myself, Amy Cardinal-Christensen, my co-lead, and 2 graduate students, research assistants, and community research assistants. So there are many of us involved in this research. There were 7 First Nations involved in this first phase of research. I'll introduce them on the next slide. And the first phase of the partnership also included 12 agencies that were involved in either carrying out or providing support during wildfire evacuations and providing services to First Nations. So with respect to the nations and communities involved in the research, in Ontario, 3 First Nations, which were evacuated in 2011, Mishkikokmong, Ojibwe Nation, Deer Lake First Nation, sorry, I'll point them out here, and Sandy Lake. So of those 3, Deer Lake and Sandy Lake are both fly-in communities, and Mish has road access. In Alberta, 2 communities were involved in research. They were evacuated in 2011 and 2012. Teneta First Nation, the Tache community, and then Whitefish Lake further south. And in Saskatchewan, Onion Lake Cree Nation and Lac La Ronge Indian Bands Stanley Mission Reserve. So languages spoken in these communities include Ojibwe, Oji Cree, Dene, and Cree. So in terms of the research that we carried out, we used qualitative social science research methods. First sat down with First Nation leaders, including the chief or councillors, to discuss the proposed research and see if they were interested in being involved. Once they were supportive, community advisory committees were established and community research assistants were recruited. With help from these community research assistants, we completed more than 200 semi-structured interviews with residents, including evacuees, those who had leadership roles, and some residents who stayed behind, including youth, adults, and elders. Shortly before our research began, the Auditor General of Canada released its audit of emergency preparedness on First Nation reserves, which indicated that some First Nations are not well prepared for emergencies. In our research, low levels of preparedness led to additional challenges during the evacuations. At the time of our research, none of the First Nations had full-time emergency managers, with those in the emergency management role doing that work off the side of their desk on top of their other full-time work, and in some cases, multiple jobs. At the time of their evacuation, 2 of the 7 First Nations had an up-to-date, complete emergency plan. 2 had partial plans or plans that were not tailored to their community, and 3 did not have a plan. This led to evacuation delays and some elders being without appropriate supports. During the full evacuation of Sandy Lake and Mishkikokemong First Nation, community leaders stayed behind in the community to look after the community, to communicate with government agencies and evacuees, provide advice, and dealt with problems during the evacuation. Community liaisons were located within most host communities. They had a variety of roles, including translation, attending meetings with agencies and First Nation leaders, and host community staff, and dealt with many other issues that came up during the evacuations. The quote that you can see here, hopefully, is from one of the leaders in Mish who talked about setting up a curfew. Many other residents also volunteered to help during the evacuations by providing food, childcare, and other services. Transportation is often a problem in wildfire evacuations. Usually this problem focuses on traffic delays, but in our research with First Nations, transportation challenges were quite different. Evacuees from Sandy Lake and Deer Lake had the uncomfortable experience of being flown out on large Hercules aircraft. Evacuees from Sandy Lake, Deer Lake, and Stanley Mission were taken to one location and then moved to another, and in some instances to yet another location before reaching their final host community. In the other 5 communities, some evacuees did not have a vehicle or gas or both. Family separation occurred during the evacuation of all First Nations in our research, but none more so than Sandy Lake, where the community of about 2,500 people living on reserve at the time of our research was separated and flown to 12 different host communities. Information is important both before and during an evacuation. Information about the fire is vital before an evacuation so that community leaders can make decisions about the threat and whether or when to evacuate. And information in the early stages of an evacuation helps people to prepare. And information while people are evacuated helps to reduce distress. In our research, we found that media often included little, if any, focus on the evacuations of these First Nation communities, instead focusing their attention on hamlets or towns. In the case of Whitefish Lake First Nation, this was understandable. The Slave Lake fire, which destroyed many homes and other buildings, was burning at the same time as their evacuation was occurring. The lack of media coverage was less understandable for the fire that caused the evacuation of residents from Denetaf First Nations Touche community. The media instead focused on the hamlet of Zama City, a population of 93 people, instead of Touche, which had a population of 400. As we see in the first quote, inadequate information during an evacuation was a particular problem in Sandy Lake, where families were split up into 12 host communities. People dealt with the lack of information by contacting people who'd stayed behind in the community. And in the case of Sandy Lake First Nation, the chief recorded videos in English and OG Cree to provide information to evacuees. Accommodation for evacuees is extremely important, and in our research was arranged by host communities where evacuees stay. So evacuees from Denetha and Whitefish in Alberta here tended to stay in hotel rooms, whereas evacuees from the First Nations in Saskatchewan and Ontario were more likely to stay in evacuation centers or similar places. We found that hotel rooms were more private, but as we see in the second quote here, there were some cases of overcrowding where a large family had to stay together in one room. It was also challenging to entertain children in hotel rooms. Evacuees who stayed in evacuation centers dealt with lack of privacy, uncomfortable cots, noise, and difficulty sleeping. An extreme example of inappropriate accommodation occurred when evacuees from Deer Lake First Nation were sent to stay in the Rideau Regional Center, which was built for people with developmental disabilities in 1963 and was closed in 2009, 2 years before the evacuation occurred. Most evacuees slept on cots in rooms or in hallways, but some evacuees, mostly children, slept on the floor because they were not given a cot. In addition, shower stalls did not have curtains. Evacuees also reported hearing eerie noises and seeing white shapes, which caused additional trauma during and after the evacuation. Four additional themes rose during our research. I'm covering two today. Food and activities are incredibly important. In our research, food was provided to evacuees in different ways. In some host communities, meals were provided at hotels, in evacuation centers, or in other community halls. In others, coupons were given to evacuees that they could use in local restaurants. And in other cases, evacuees were given money to buy their own food. Most interview participants spoke positively about the food that they received, but some evacuees, particularly the elders, missed traditional foods such as wild meat, bannock, and berries. In some cases, for example, during the evacuation of Whitefish Lake, Sandy Lake, and Mish, nearby First Nations provided traditional food and helped to prepare and serve meals, which was appreciated by evacuees. Evacuees also spoke positively about barbecues organized by the town's mayor. In terms of activities for evacuees, in addition to providing meals, arrangements should also be made to plan activities to keep both adults and children occupied. In some host communities, activities were organized for evacuees, while in others, there were few, if any, activities arranged. The second quote here is from an evacuee from Sandy Lake First Nation who was hosted in Jinugamong First Nation in Ontario. You can see the types of activities that they were able to enjoy while they were staying in the community. Importantly, once people return to their home community, impacts continue. During our interviews as part of the First Nations Wildfire Evacuation Partnership, evacuees expressed their continuing distress over their experiences and worries about an evacuation occurring in the future. While we have many academic inputs from the partnership research, including publications and presentations at conferences, I wanted to, for this audience in particular, mention our book, which is divided into the 6 stages of an evacuation. It includes more stories about First Nation wildfire evacuations from our research, recommendations for reducing negative impacts of evacuations, and also guiding questions for communities to think about in terms of how they're preparing. And I'll just leave it there for now. Thanks very much.
Dr. McGee, thank you so much for your presentation. We're so grateful for your taking the time to share these insights with us. And that book, I would highly recommend to everyone in the audience as a great resource to check out. Our next speaker today is Jennifer Jesty. Jennifer Jesty is the Emergency Resiliency Manager with the Union of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq, and she developed the McGee Emergency Alert System that allows all 5 Indigenous communities in Cape Breton to send emergency alerts to just their own community members. Indeed, Ms. Jesty recently stood before the House of Commons to share her success with this alert system. The federal government is in the beginning stages of developing nationwide alert systems for missing and murdered Indigenous women, and asked Jennifer to share her knowledge and her successes. Jennifer is also the first Indigenous woman to become a member of the Nova Scotia Firefighters Association and the first Indigenous woman to become an advanced care paramedic at the Centre for Emergency Medicine in Pittsburgh, as well as in Nova Scotia. When Jennifer is not pouring out her heart and her soul into her work, you can find her in her barn with her beloved horse, Bo. Jennifer, the floor is yours, and we're so excited to learn from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. You know, I won't lie, I often think about evacuating the community in which I'm a band member in, and that's the community of Eskasoni. Eskasoni is the largest Mi'kmaq settlement in the world, with roughly 5,000 people living in this community. It's basically a one-way in, one-way out. There's one main road that goes through the community, and the majority of my family live there. So when you start to think about the logistics behind evacuating a community of that size, and let's talk about it being 2 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, where is everybody going to go? Are we going to have to break up families and put them in different communities? What if it was more than one of our Indigenous communities affected? We have 5 here in Cape Breton, some of them in close proximity to each other. So what happens when we have to evacuate more than one at a time? As the emergency resiliency manager for the union, it makes me really worried that we are nowhere near prepared for an evacuation. However, I do believe one of the most important things when it comes to evacuations is communication on a number of different levels. Not just letting the community know that they have to be evacuated. Now we have to remain in contact with those families to make sure that they've left the community safely, that they've arrived at the specific destination, and that they're able to communicate with their other family members, including when it comes time to return home. We have to be able to disseminate that information in a timely fashion, in an appropriate manner. So when I first came into this role right in the middle of the pandemic in 2020, I kind of said to my boss, well, what do you want me to do? And she says, I don't know. We've never had an emergency manager before. So I sit down and start to think, well, I can't just sit here and do nothing. I don't know how to do that. And so I started to think about one of the incidents that we were right on the heels of it. And it was the largest mass shooting in Nova Scotia, actually in Canadian history, in a small town called Portapique on the mainland of Nova Scotia, which is about a 4-hour drive from where we live here in Cape Breton. And I thought to myself, what would happen if somebody walked in and started shooting people in the community in which I'm from? What are we going to do? Well, what's the first thing we need to do? We need to tell everybody. How are we going to do that? And so was born our Onamagi emergency alert system. We utilize the Everbridge platform for this alert system that I've developed. And the reason why we selected the Everbridge platform was for 2 major factors. One was because you're able to send the alert to a landline. And I know there are other companies within Canada that provide much the same service that Everbridge does for us. However, they weren't able to send that message to a landline. A lot of our elders in our communities still have landlines. They're not connected to technology. And part of that reason is because not all of our communities have self-service throughout the entire community. And the second reason why we chose the Everbridge platform was because the chief is able to record his own message, which means he can record it in his own language. And in the midst of a crisis, such as an evacuation, you have to make sure that there are no barriers. And language can be a barrier during that time in our First Nations communities. So with him being able to record his own voice to send out that critical information, now we don't have to worry about there being any gaps or misinterpretation of the information. Currently, our Onamagi emergency alert system has just over 4,000 people subscribed to the system. We've sent out a total of 180 alerts since its inception in September of 2020. and we've reunited 80 young people with their families because of the alert system. 96% of those have been reunited with their families within the first hour of the alert being sent. Now it's interesting to watch what happens on social media once we send out an alert. People are very quick to take screenshots on their phones or on their devices, post them to their social media accounts, and now our alerts are reaching far more people than just those that are subscribed to the system. We've decided to not just allow Indigenous people to sign up for the alerts. There are people in the surrounding areas that are not far from our communities that have now asked to sign up for the system as well. We're not denying them because we live in a society now that is information hungry. And I feel like every single Nova Scotian and maybe most Canadians, we have some degree of PTSD ever since Portapic happened. And now we're information hungry because we're worried about our safety, as we should be. So our Onamagi emergency alert system is growing daily. And just over the weekend, so we don't just send out alerts for missing persons. We send out every kind of alert, anything that is going to directly affect the well-being and safety of our community members. So on the weekend just passed, we ended up having kind of an active shooter event in one of our communities. It initially started out where it was kind of rival gang members engaging in this, but then it quickly turned into shots fired at the general public. Our communities ended up going into lockdown. We were able to communicate with the authorities who gave us that information in a timely fashion. The really nice thing about our own Onamagi emergency alert system is that it's developed by us for us, which means there's no red tape. If a chief decides that he needs to send out a message to the community that's important, he has the ability to do that. All he has to do is put in his username and password, type out the message, and hit send, and that message goes to all forms of communication at once. The beauty of that is that there's no red tape. We don't have to wait. We don't have to wait for anybody's say-so. We don't need permission from anybody to go ahead and send out this information. And the information also can be whatever we want it to be. So when I met with the 5 chiefs of our communities, we sat down and developed very loose protocols. And it turns out they basically ended up serving as guidelines more than anything, because each case where it comes to sending out an alert has been very unique. At no time has there been a request for an alert that's been denied. And at no time has any resident ever taken to a social media account and said, "Stop sending me alerts." As I said, I feel everybody is in a state where we are quite information hungry, and we need to know that information to protect ourselves. So during the event in the past week, we ended up sending out alerts almost by the hour. So when the decision was made that we are now closing all band operated facilities, we're closing the school, we're sending your children home because of this ongoing criminal activity, we were able to send that information out immediately. Then once the all clear was given, we were able to do the same. So you're able to send out the alert within minutes of receiving the information to say, okay, it's all clear. Everybody can go back. The suspect has been apprehended. And again, because we developed this system ourselves, we don't have to follow any particular provincial or federal protocols or guidelines around the system because it's ours. In my perfect world, I would love to be able to go to every First Nations community in this entire country and set up this exact same alert system. Has it saved lives? I don't know. But I think moving forward, it certainly has the opportunity to be able to do that. If anybody on the call is interested in any more information about our system or how they can set it up either in their community or even forward on my contact information to a community that you think might be in need, please don't hesitate to reach out whatsoever. I'm happy to share all of my contact information and more of our success stories. So thank you very much. That leaves me 1 minute for questions. I'm trying to stay within our time limit. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here and for sharing these insights. It's just an incredible project, and incredible the impact that you're having. Just like Jennifer, I would encourage you to share your comments and questions in the chat below. We'll compile these together after our final speakers. So please use that Q&A function to share any questions that you might have. Our last two speakers, Michelle Gervais and Maia Foster-Sanchez, come from the Stronger Together Evacuation Partnerships. Michelle is an emergency management and public safety professional with extensive experience working alongside First Nations, municipal, provincial, and federal partners during, prior to, and following emergencies. She's worked as an emergency management special advisor and evacuation specialist, deputy fire chief, an EM special advisor to the Grand Chief, a firefighter, a flight paramedic with Orange, just innumerable roles and experience that she has. She's also made significant contributions to Operation Remote Immunity, which distributed COVID-19 vaccines across remote First Nations in Northern Ontario. Maia Foster-Sanchez is an EM policy analyst, emergency manager, and multimedia producer from Dish with One Spoon territory. Maia has experience in First Nations evacuations, emergency management research, and public history education. Her broader research has focused on the intersection of colonialism, disasters, health, and policymaking. She's directed and produced various series, including the Voices from Here or Oral History series, the Story of a National Crime podcast, the Among Equals podcast, and the Last Resort video series. And Maia, Michelle, we are so grateful to have you here today and can't wait to learn from you. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to start by sharing my screen, and I'm going to put it into presentation mode. Can you just confirm that you see the logo and everything?
Yes, all is good.
Okay, thank you so much. So I want to open by expressing how nice it is to present alongside my operational mentor, Michelle, and my academic mentor, Tara. And while I don't know Jennifer personally, I have heard about the incredible work that she has done on alerting from colleagues. So Michelle and I are going to cover the context around First Nations hosting operations in Ontario. We're going to talk a little bit about some ongoing challenges. We're going to present a case study from 2021. And we're going to talk about emergency management partnerships as a solution to some of the challenges, knowing that this is very complex. So before we get into Stronger Together, I want to just provide a bit of context about First Nations evacuations in Ontario. So for those who don't know, Indigenous Services Canada has an agreement with Ontario regarding the provision of emergency response to First Nations. As you can imagine, it's marked by a lot of interjurisdictional complexity because it's more than 130 First Nations, neighboring municipalities, a province, a federal department, and a variety of service providers who need to coordinate very quickly. And what's distinct from other jurisdictions in Ontario is that all hosting partners have to follow a service level evacuation standard for First Nations evacuations. And within this standard, we have the roles and responsibilities. We also have things like accommodations, food, recreation, personal services, healthcare, family reunification, as well as cultural supports. And I'd say in host communities, the experiences of First Nations evacuees have varied, as Tara has shared earlier today. But there have been many instances of host communities not providing things like interpreters and translators, accommodations for extended families, and culturally relevant supports, as well as spiritual supports. So I met Michelle initially doing research in Timmins, and obviously over the past 5 years, we've come up with some ideas around recommendations, including familiarity with Indigenous and colonial history, and with contemporary evacuating communities, incorporating evacuated communities' priorities and needs into hosting operations, knowing one's hosting roles and responsibilities, as well as the hosting partners' roles and responsibilities, so that there are no gaps in a hosting plan. And of course, planning for sustainability of operations and capacity limits to ensure that the people that we're responsible to care for are taken care of and limited regional services are not overwhelmed. Things that have come up in the research as well has been planning for child well-being and provision of psychosocial and crisis supports. But what I really want to conclude with this context section is that these challenges, these lessons, these recommendations, they're not new. They've been documented over and over and over again. So if you're looking to support First Nations evacuations and hosting, familiarize yourself with, the reports, with the studies, but really move towards meaningfully engaging with communities and Indigenous service providers on their terms. I'd say that, Michelle is the first person to say calling the Friendship Center at the last minute after evacuees have arrived is going to be a bit late. So we also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've noticed over time within hosting operations, so receiving evacuees from evacuating First Nations. There's this tendency to avoid planning for the worst case scenario. And I have certainly heard before that will never happen again. They will never evacuate again. That won't happen here. And then we're not necessarily testing our limits. And often that results in the thing happening that people have said isn't going to happen. The other thing is that plans end up collecting dust and, they're only revisited during crises. It's really hard to wrap your head around something when you have about 10 minutes to figure it out. One of the ones I'm thinking of is the Ontario Mass Evacuation Plan Far North, which was created after the time that, Tara is talking about with the 2011 evacuations from First Nations. It's the kind of thing that you want to know like the back of your hand when it happens. But of course, if you haven't revisited in a few years, it can be quite a challenge. I'd say that there's been not a lot of capacity building and investment in things to reduce evacuations from First Nations. So for those who haven't read the OAG report, the Auditor General's report on First Nations emergency management, the one from November 2022, you can read one. There's another report called From the Ashes from 2018. There's another report from 2013. They say similar things, but there needs to be more investment in the proactive side of things. Of course, we also feel that training and resources are required not only for mass evacuations, but for host communities, because they've often been operating with limited guidance. And when it comes to partners and jurisdictions, it's really useful to share those experiences and lessons between each other. I know earlier this year, I was talking to someone who works for Dene Nation, and what she was describing to me was exactly what we've seen many, many times in past evacuation experiences in other parts of Canada when they evacuated from Northwest Territories. And I thought, I wish that some of these lessons were shared so that the service providers can be prepared to meet some of these needs. But one thing we really underline is there's no one size fits all approach. So even if I share my experience, it's still really important to work with the communities to make sure that we are incorporating their priorities and their needs into hosting plans. And of course, relationship building, and this is what we're going to keep repeating today, is the foundation for successful hosting. So I'm going to turn it over to Michelle and mute myself.
Thanks, Maia, and thanks everyone for having me join you today. It's an absolute honor to be speaking to First Nation evacuations. I've been very fortunate and blessed to be involved with many amazing professionals and communities during these events, and I'm happy to share this information and anything else afterwards as well. As Maia said, those famous last words, it will never happen. I've heard it will never happen that flood and wildfire evacuees are going to come out within less than 24 hours back to back. I've heard it while I had baby formula for my own child in my hair and hadn't had any sleep from a 15-day evacuation moving into another 30 days. I've heard it where a complex community will never evacuate twice in less than a month. I've heard it where we will never run out of host capacity and we have more than enough. We have. We've had some really bad days. The good news is we have really good people who will have the right intentions and are trying to move forward in the right ways. Part of where we're going with this relationship piece really came from the COVID-19 response in ORI, as well as many other case studies. I mean, you could find 100 of them for sure. But during ORI, we really focused in on the 3 Rs, right? It was really about relationships, respect, and reality. We had to understand that if we were going to get anything done, we had to work together. We had to build relationships. I can't tell you enough. Coffee and conversations are going to move more mountains than any paper process or exercise you do. And it's respect. It's about respecting people and where they stand and what they're doing today and how it's going to help you work together. And if you can't respect one another for who they are or who you are, it's not going to work. And the third key to success is accepting reality. You can have everything on paper, and I'm going to tell you that something's going to bust through that door and just surprise you. You got to be ready for it all. And with ORI, we've seen that, and we were able to be flexible and nimble to approach it in different ways that met the needs of the communities for where they were at that very time. The 2021 wildfire season, my coffee honestly wasn't strong enough for that, and I think a lot of people would repeat that same statement. It was 793,000 hectares. It was 1,200 fires across the province. I told Maia, if you don't mind putting this map up, because to me, this map just highlights that it was busy. And at one point, we were looking at evacuating up to 8,000 community members. Unfortunately, we had 6 communities evacuate 3,400. And if you want to talk about busy, it was busy. We, at the time in Ontario, relied heavily on their traditional host capacity, meaning the Highway 11 corridor and our partners over in Thunder Bay, as well as a couple in the GTA, would be available to have and be ready to accept evacuees within a 24, 48, 72-hour notice. What we've seen is that capacity was getting very fatigued and that you can only sustain operations for so long. We needed more capacity. And that was not anything that anyone could hide. We just simply did not have enough beds. And beds is only one piece of the equation. Finding beds is actually the easiest part of the equation. It's finding the right supports to do the wraparound services. Because if we evacuate based on we can find beds, we're opening up the opportunity for a secondary emergency. And sometimes, if not almost all the times, that can be equally as bad, if not worse. So what we'd seen in 2021 was we were trying to essentially build the plane while we were flying it. We were trying to find host capacity and build up capacity by mentorship, by explaining what things were going on. We had new sites who wanted to come on board, who wanted to help. Organizations that maybe traditionally would have nothing to do with anything emergency management, let alone evacuations, were coming forward. But the problem was they were calling the active host sites for ideas or to bounce ideas off of them, kind of get a better understanding of the concepts of operations. And I'm going to tell you, when you're running an 18-hour-a-day hosting, 400 people yourself, your mind isn't really clear. It doesn't matter how strong that coffee is. Your mind's not exactly clear about how to set up operations. But the good news is there's a lot of good people trying to do good work, and ad hoc volunteerism or ad hoc supports were coming into place. It's just, there's so many complexities to the evacuations that you can't just build up that host site in a moment's notice. You have to have it based on relationships. And if that's the one piece of advice I can give you and you take away from any of my speaking, it's please have that coffee and conversation well in advance to the event itself. Maia, I'll just have you go to the next slide, please. So with that, we were able to get some downtime eventually out of 2021 and started doing our after action report and looking at where are some opportunities to improve? How can we make this better? So when new hosts are coming on site, how can we share our story? How can we share best practice? And how can we ensure that First Nation communities are always first? The evacuated community is always the first, and it has to be First Nations led. That is the whole foundation of Stronger Together evacuation partnerships. The idea of the Stronger Together framework is really built on the economic development partnerships and incident management system. Incident management in Ontario is very similar to the incident command system, and that's a whole other discussion we can have another day. But essentially what it does is it takes the planning aspect to build out your con ops, so your continuity of operations and how you're going to operate the entire evacuation site itself. It really talks about building the relationship up with your neighboring First Nation communities. So if you're a municipality and you're living on and next to a First Nations community, if you're hosting without engaging them, I'm going to tell you right now, you're doing it wrong. Take the opportunity to engage with them. keep the seat at the table. They may or may not want to be involved, but keep the seat at the table and work on that relationship. The other thing is to really sit back and listen to the evacuated community. Just because they're in an emergency doesn't mean they are not able to look after themselves. What they need is support. And so with the Stronger Together evacuation model, we say it's always the evacuated community in the middle. They're still strong. They're still very resilient individuals, still a strong, tight-knit community. And then we say, bring in your First Nation partners around them, whether that's the Friendship Center, the PTOs, the tribal councils, the neighboring First Nation communities. And the role of the municipality and the host site is really to ensure that the supports are there. It's to ensure that if you need a bus, that's the last thing their First Nation partners need to worry about, a bus. Okay. It's all about building that home away from home. And the only way to do that is to listen about what home is and to give space to create that home again. That is the role. And it really incorporates the GEM standards, again, as a minimum standard, because we say we can be doing better, we should be doing better. And that's the idea of the partnerships. Maia, I'll turn it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. So just as a last thing, you know, we're looking at building relationships and networks, you know, for more than evacuations, for resource sharing, etc., you know, in emergency management, in, you know, amongst scarcity, if you will. But we also have the handbook here. If you want to use it, feel free to share it with whoever you would like to share it with. One thing we underline is if you would like to work with a neighboring nation, make sure that if they have a consultation protocol, you follow it on their terms. And remember, there's no universal approach. You can't really checklist this one. You have to go through the process. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Maia and Michelle. We're so grateful for these insights and for all of the work that you're doing in the space. Thank you. We have limited time here together, but there are several great questions already in the chat, and I'd encourage people to use the Q&A function below if you do have any questions. Given we have so limited time, I'm going to try to bring them together a little bit. There were two questions for, I think, for all of our panelists, really, about the role of the private sector when it comes to First Nation evacuation. Chris was asking about the role that private sector entities can play when it comes to protecting communities. And then Stephen was asking about how this connects with procurement. So if I can invite Jennifer and Tara to join Michelle and Maia here, and then see if any of them have thoughts about the role of the private sector when it comes to wildfire protection, when it comes to the challenges in procurement in Indigenous communities, or any related issues.
So I can just start off by saying that here in Cape Breton, when it comes to emergency management in general, we are far behind the 8 ball. A lot of our communities, the person that is doing the emergency management role within their communities is usually a full-time something else, housing director, public works director, and so on. So emergency management has largely been at the bottom of the pile on everybody's desk. And then I come along in 2020 and start asking the questions. And unfortunately, we are no further ahead here in Cape Breton than we were when I started here. It seems like I get the kind of same response when I go to communities of it's not going to happen to us. Okay, yeah, that's an unfortunate way to think. And I hope it's not going to happen to us. But we are not, in no way are we even close to prepared for even a partial evacuation of one of our communities. Private sector is going to play a major role in that. And the reason for that is because in Cape Breton, our resources are very limited here on a good day. And so when you're talking about relocating an Indigenous community, there's going to be a pretty good chance that there's going to be evacuations in non-Indigenous communities surrounding that area. And so we are going to be heavily reliant on the private sector for that. Now, in my perfect world, I would certainly love to be sitting down and having these conversations, bringing in the private sector. getting some MOUs into place. However, as I often say, God blessed me with many gifts, but patience is not one of them. And I want this done now, but nobody's really listening. And it's unfortunate that here in Cape Breton, and not just in the Indigenous communities, but we tend to react rather than prepare. And a lot of that is largely because we're just so busy. There's so much going on, and our communities are constantly putting out fires, shall I say? And so we never get the opportunity to get out in front of and prepare for said fire. So yes, we will be very heavily reliant on the public sector if it ever does happen here in Cape Breton.
Thanks, Jennifer. Given we only have about 2 more minutes here, I'm going to try to lightning round 2 more questions. Tara, the first one is coming for you. Anna was asking in the Q&A about the Western model of evacuations and the ways in which it seems wholly unequipped to handle evacuations. Are there other models that perhaps are more culturally safe that exist elsewhere in the world that we can learn from? Any examples that come to mind that are things we could learn from?
That's an interesting one. I mean, essentially, it's the Indigenous leader is the one who makes the decision about whether to call for an evacuation. So it's up to them. They can decide whether to evacuate part of the community, people at high risk from wildfire smoke, for example. They could evacuate the whole community. They can decide whether they stay behind. So they're the decision maker ultimately in terms of making that call. I mean, there was a situation a few years ago where First Nation in BC did not evacuate, and again, that's their call. They're the one to make that decision. For communities, regardless of whether they evacuate or not, they need to be well prepared. So they do need to have a high level of preparedness, those relationships that Michelle and Maia were talking about, so that they can safely either evacuate or not, whatever they decide is appropriate for their community.
Thanks so much. And Michelle and Maia, maybe I'll throw this last question to you with apologies for only 30 seconds to answer such a huge one. Constance was asking about whether there have been changes when it comes to collaboration and community engagement since the onset of COVID, or really changes that you've seen recently in terms of working with communities when it comes to evacuation partnerships.
I can speak to that one. There has been some significant progress in the willingness to approach the conversation. The conversations are never easy and they're often complex, but we have seen our provincial partners have opened up a First Nations branch for Emergency Management Ontario, and they are doing some work proactively in the PEOC to engage with PTOs and tribal councils. The unfortunate circumstances are, however, that Indigenous Service Canada has failed to significantly support the community level and the tribal council PTO level emergency managers. And without having adequate funding and support for those key players in place, we're not going to move forward. Quite simply, in order to have a conversation, you need to have all parties at the table. And unless we're going to support that, we're not making progress.
I wish we had hours more for these conversations because they're such important topics, and I have a million questions here that I want to ask, but unfortunately all I can do is end with gratitude for all of you being willing to take your time today and share with us incredible work and incredible insights. I'll call upon Francesco to just wrap us up with announcements about the next session, but again, thank you so much to each of you for sharing, and to all of our audience for being here to listen and learn today.
Thank you so much. Yeah, just to quickly wrap up, I know we're just a little over time. I would just like to thank everybody for taking the time to be here today. Thank you so much to all of you for presenting and speaking on such an important topic. Thank you, of course, to all of our partners in this project, and to Professor Kennedy for moderating today's session. And of course, thank you to May and Hunter, our ASL interpreters, for today's session. And of course, one last final thank you to everybody in the audience for taking the time to be here, participate, asking questions. I apologize if we weren't able to get to everybody's questions. But yeah, I hope everybody learned a lot and was able to take away the key points from today's presentations. And with that, just to quickly wrap up, just as a reminder, this session is being recorded and will be posted on our CFAL York YouTube channel, as well as on the event website itself. And this is a monthly series that we are producing. So just as another reminder, our next session will be July 16th. So please mark that on your calendars if it is of interest to you, and please feel free to share it in your networks, as registration is always open and free for these sessions. So with that, just one last big final thanks to everybody. It was a great session. Thank you so much for being here and speaking on this topic.